What we're seeing in Ukraine is an example of a conflict that is going to have a winner and a loser. Large-scale drone swarms powered by artificial intelligence. We don't have the capability of defending against that. I'm Colonel Richard Kemp. I was a British Army commander for 30 years. I served many operational tours in Northern Ireland, both Gulf Wars, in Afghanistan and in the Balkans, among other places. In Afghanistan, I was commander of British forces in 2003 for about 6 months, and the British forces at that time were mainly based in Kabul and areas of northern Afghanistan. It was before the British Army deployed into Helmand when they got involved in some of the heaviest fighting of the campaign. And our role then was we took part in security operations, including counter-terrorist patrolling and other activities. In the era of Iraq and Afghanistan, Western armies got used to dealing with relatively low-level insurgencies. Small groups of terrorists. The main weapons they were using on the whole were IEDs, improvised explosive devices, snipers, that kind of activity against regular armed forces, which in many ways are at a disadvantage when they're operating in the kind of terrain we're talking about, with terrorists blending into the civilian population. I remember seeing at the time many commentators and so-called experts claiming this is the future of warfare. But actually, Western armies have now had to have a rethink about that since the Ukraine war. For the first time in recent history in Europe, since the Second World War, we've seen the clash of two major uniformed armies. What we're seeing in Ukraine is an example of a conflict that is going to have a winner and a loser, much more stark than we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's not just the difference between a kind of insurgency campaign and a state-on-state campaign. It's also the development in weapon systems. And the two most important weapon systems that have been developed and proliferated in Ukraine are precision long-range missiles and drones. This is a step change, I think. And it's not just about the use of long-range missiles and drones, it's about defense against those things. I can remember when I first joined the army, we were in Germany to fight back mass tank formations pouring across the inner German border. Well, that kind of threat arguably doesn't really exist anymore. It does in Ukraine, but it doesn't exist in relation to our country. What does exist now, much more than ever before, is the potential to use large numbers of long-range precision-guided missiles fired from Russia, fired from areas of Ukraine that Russia may be able to hold on to. Drones fired over very long distances, perhaps in swarms of drones, large-scale drone swarms powered by artificial intelligence. And we don't have, in this country, we do not have, and the same goes for other European countries, we don't have the capability of defending against that. It's, I think, potentially a very real threat for the future. It may not be an immediate threat, because I think Russia, for example, is preoccupied in Ukraine, but it certainly is a threat that could occur in the future, directly targeting our homeland and potentially doing a great deal of damage to it. I've been in Ukraine several times, including in Kiev when it was under attack by Russian drones and also by missiles. And I have to say, I never really expected to be in a Western city which was being attacked by drones and missiles. But that is the reality. It's the new reality we live in. Therefore, I think one of our focuses for the future needs to be on two things: developing our own offensive capabilities, much more using drones and long-range missiles. And secondly, a huge amount more emphasis on dealing with those attacks using those systems on our own country. We do need a comprehensive shield now, I think, in Europe against use of drones and missiles, and not just by Russia, but also by terrorist organizations. It certainly is not beyond the bounds of possibility for organizations like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to obtain these systems and fire them from a range of different places at us. I think if Putin prevails in Ukraine and either seizes more territory or holds onto the territory he's already taken, then it's just a matter of time before he licks his wounds and is emboldened to move on, to even further increase his dream of a greater Russia. And that could involve attacks against NATO countries in the future. It could involve incursions on NATO territory. And if that happens, personally, I don't think that NATO is ready for it. I do believe that if Putin decided to attack Poland, even if he does it as part of the current campaign, for example, or the Baltic states, I do wonder whether NATO would retaliate as it would need to retaliate. I do find it quite hard to envisage a situation where a German leader, a French leader, or even a British leader is going to send their young men and women to fight in battle for some far-flung Eastern European country that no one has ever heard of. I hope I'm wrong in that, but I do sense that that's the case. And I know that people will say that we are under treaty obligation in NATO, but I do suspect that not only does NATO not really have the capability to do it, certainly not without the US, without US engagement, but I also really doubt whether there is the political will there. I think the other area where we're likely to see, potentially to see an outbreak of conflict is in the Pacific, where China very clearly has its desires on Taiwan. And I don't think that we've seen enough strength indicated from the West to really deter a move on Taiwan by President Xi. I think had we seen a stronger defense of Ukraine by the US in particular and by European countries, and a much stronger response to Iran's aggression against Israel, and when I say Iran, I mean Iran and its proxies, I think that but one of those two things or both could have served as maybe as a deterrent against President Xi, but he hasn't seen that degree of strength, I think. And it's quite possible that he could calculate that I can get away with that without too many repercussions on myself. I think we may well see developments in the air war in future conflicts. And so far in the Middle East, we've seen Israel with air supremacy over all of its enemies and the ability to use combat aircraft with pretty much impunity without any real threat of air defenses, or at least air defenses that can't be relatively easily neutralized. Ukraine doesn't really have much in the way of an air force at the moment, although it's being built up to a degree. I think that we'd see a different picture there, with aircraft being much more vulnerable to what are some pretty effective Russian air defense systems. But I think at the moment that we're not going to see a huge change to the status quo in the air, because combat aircraft can operate in a way and be effective in a way that drones can't be effective, and that long-range missiles can't necessarily be effective either. And that's why I do think there's a scope for significant change in that in the future, and that might include much more effective and extensive use of drones. Currently they have capabilities, but they're not comparable to combat aircraft. But with swarms of drones, which are becoming more viable now, that I think that potentially could change. And we could potentially see in the future the era of conventional air power replaced to a large extent potentially by large-scale drone operations and also long-range precision-guided missiles. In relation to naval operations, we've seen a very striking situation in the Black Sea where, in some cases, homemade Ukrainian drone vessels have been used to do immense damage to the Russian Black Sea fleet. And that, of course, brings up the question of the future of large surface vessels, in particular surface vessels. We shouldn't go too far in our analysis of, or our projection of, what the Black Sea situation means for naval operations generally, because the Black Sea is a pretty much constrained seaway, and the same vulnerabilities as exist there do not necessarily apply to naval operations on the high seas. So I think I would guess that for the foreseeable future, at least, there is a significant future for naval power, but the existence of both underwater and surface drones could help shape the way in which navies operate. And I think one observation I would make is how little Britain's used its naval power in the Red Sea in relation to the Houthis. And I think that begs the question as to why it is, why we haven't deployed one of our 2 new aircraft carriers into the Red Sea to be even more effective against the Houthis than we have been. And I guess that's got something to do with fears of vulnerability. And so I think because again, the Red Sea is a relatively constrained seaway as well. So I think, not only on land, but also in the air and at sea, warfare has been evolving quite fast in recent years and will continue to evolve. Every country in the world is, I think, doing its best to develop defensive cyber capabilities, and in many cases offensive cyber capabilities as well. And it's a relatively new realm that can be potentially hugely damaging. For example, if we end up in a conflict in the Pacific with China, we could very easily see Chinese cyber attacks directed against the UK, which can be hugely damaging. There's also the potential to exploit our very heavy reliance on undersea fiber optic cables, and we've seen Russian activity threatening some of these cables, and the UK as well as every other country is hugely dependent on fiber optic cables under the sea, and they're very vulnerable as well. All of these different relatively new capabilities, offensive and defensive, I think will figure very largely in future warfare, not to mention the great reliance we have now on satellite systems, which are also potentially very vulnerable to attack.